When I visit Sydney, it's usually for one very specific reason: to photograph trains. Or sometimes trams, or sometimes ferries. But this year I made an extra trip that wasn't about any of that. This was a trip with my family. While this trip wasn't about public transport, it was entirely using public transport. Over the 4 days we were there, the only rubber-tired vehicles we stepped foot in were buses. This video is going to be a bit different to usual. It's a personal story of my experience travelling between Australia's two largest cities, the challenges of long-distance travel with kids in tow, and why I think interstate rail travel is still a pretty viable option despite many decades of underinvestment and competition from the air. On this particular journey, we had myself and my partner and our two preschool-age kids, and their companions, Fancy the rabbit and Twinkletoes the unicorn. Obviously, I'm not going to reveal too much personal information here, but my kids are of the age where they're both happy to carry their own bag most of the time and are pretty good at walking, just not always in the direction you want them to go. Ignoring driving as an option, getting to Sydney from Melbourne can be done by plane, which is what most people do, or by train, which is what cool people do. It's about 715 kilometres in a straight line, with a rail distance of 953 kilometres, which is roughly 75 k's longer than the road distance, mainly due to the railway taking a very windy route through some very hilly areas in New South Wales. Despite being something that's been an option for literally all of our lives, a lot of Australians, especially my age and younger, are actually quite unfamiliar with interstate rail travel. A lot of people I've spoken to in Melbourne are only vaguely aware that it's even an option, if at all, and most people definitely aren't aware that you can travel from Melbourne to Sydney overnight in a bed. More on that in a moment. Flying to Sydney takes a little over an hour in the air, which, when you include the associated airport and waiting time, occupies around 3 to 4 hours of your day. The train is timetabled for roughly 11 hours, and there are 2 departures from Melbourne every day, one at 8:30am and one at 7:50pm, so you can choose to travel over a full day or through a full night. As you can imagine, most people will take one look at those running times and immediately choose to fly. Now, you probably know this even if you're not a parent, but flying with kids is pretty hard. Flying involves a lot of waiting and a lot of sitting strapped into a seat, two things kids really hate. My kids in particular really don't cope well with that kind of thing, and the thought of taking them on the plane was honestly pretty alarming. It's bad enough sitting near someone else's screaming kids on a plane, but when it's your own kid, there's the added factor of having to deal with that situation in a very public environment. I've caught the overnight train many times before without kids in tow, and I've always just travelled sitting up in economy. If you've ever travelled overnight on a plane, you'll have some idea of what this experience is like. Just on the train you get more legroom, you don't have to wear a seatbelt, and you can safely get up and go for a walk if you want. Taking the kids in the sitting car was certainly not going to be an option, at least not if any of the other passengers wanted to get some sleep. However, the trains that operate the Melbourne to Sydney route, the XPTs, do include one proper sleeping car with beds in private compartments. We figured if we could book out a couple of sleeping compartments, the kids would very likely sleep for a large part of the trip. If they didn't, we'd at least be separate from other passengers, and it would also just be a fun and memorable experience, hopefully for both us and them. This was also an opportunity to relive something from my own childhood. Here I am before I had a YouTube channel boarding the Melbourne Express at Central in 1990. This was before budget airlines were really a thing, and I'm sure that cost was the main deciding factor for my parents in taking the train both ways. We travelled in a sitting car, and apparently I was small enough to sleep on the tray table, not something I've attempted to do since. For various reasons, we decided that catching the train would only really be practical for the northbound trip this time. One of the considerations here was that on the final day, we would need to check out of our accommodation by 10am and then need to keep the kids happy out and about until the departure time of 8:40pm, which would have been quite challenging, so we decided to return by air on a mid-afternoon flight. As much as we were still pretty apprehensive about flying with the kids, we also decided it would provide a good opportunity to directly compare both options, which would hopefully make the decision easier to make for future adventures. Now, booking a bed in the sleeping car normally costs $235 compared to just $94 for an economy seat, so I was fully prepared for this to be a pretty expensive option for 4 people, probably a fair bit more than flying. The first hurdle I faced was that, for some reason that I still haven't quite managed to pin down, you can't book the sleeping compartments online. By the way, New South Wales Trainlink calls them sleeping cabins, but I'm going to call them compartments because that's the more traditional railway term. So the online booking form tells you to call up to book a sleeping compartment. Now, as a millennial, I will go to great lengths to avoid making phone calls, and honestly, if I wasn't so keen on taking the train, this may well have been enough to steer me back to booking with an airline. But we really wanted to give this a go, so bravely, I picked up the phone. The first thing the automated menu voice does is try to make you go away and book online instead.
Welcome to New South Wales TrainLink. Did you know you can plan and book your ticket online at transportnsw.info/regional? In 3 easy steps, you can...
If you ever attempt this yourself, do not listen to this advice, as there is a serious risk you could be trapped in a loop for eternity following the instructions of both the website and the phone menu. After being on hold for a while, I finally got through and asked to book 2 adults and 2 kids in the sleeping car from Melbourne to Sydney. Each compartment has 2 beds, so I assumed with 4 of us we'd need to book 2 compartments. However, after hearing the ages of the kids, the staff member on the other end went away to check something and came back to tell me that small children can be booked in the same bed as a parent they're travelling with, meaning we could book all 4 of us into a single compartment. It seemed to me that there were some complicated underlying rules here that this person had to consult. A younger child had to be on the bottom bunk, meaning the elder child had to be on the top bunk, but was not allowed to be on the top bunk alone, so you probably can't do this with 2 really young kids. I tried to find the exact rules for this on the Transport New South Wales website and came up with nothing. In fact, if you press the button to show the fare rules for the sleeping compartments, it says they're not available. I did find the Transport for New South Wales Fare Handbook, which is over 100 pages long, and the only thing it really says is that the maximum age for a child sharing with a parent is 10, which honestly seems way too high. I don't think a 10-year-old would actually fit next to their parent on the bed. Anyway, I was kind of hoping this whole arrangement would mean the kids would travel for free. However, they still get charged the cost of an adult economy seat, which honestly feels like a bit of a rip-off given they're effectively not occupying any space at all in a 2-bed compartment already containing 2 adults. However, it was still a lot less than I was expecting to pay, coming in at a total of $652. If we'd had to book 4 beds, it would have been $938. The phone call had taken about 25 minutes and was not exactly the smoothest of booking processes, but I think a lot of that was due to the person having to consult the rules for what was obviously a slightly unconventional booking. I get the impression not many people do this. Now, there's absolutely no question that if you're an adult travelling with carry-on luggage only, there is no way this could work out cheaper than flying. However, we did have some checked luggage on this trip, which is free on the train by the way, and by the time I'd booked flights with luggage allowance and paid for seat selection, the cost of flying already exceeded the cost of our rail travel by about $40. And that's before you even include things like travel to and from the airport at each end or the $9 croissants at the airport. So I really didn't go into this expecting the sleeping car to be cheaper than flying, but it was, right from the start. In the weeks leading up to the trip, a lot of people asked how I'd be getting there, and on hearing that we'd be taking the train overnight with our kids, most reactions varied from pity to sheer horror. I would guess that the significant majority of Australians alive today have never spent the night in a proper sleeping car, at least not in Australia. And I think as a whole, it's a concept people really struggle with, and indeed the concept of night trains in general. I'm sure a lot of viewers of this channel already know this, but the real strength of a night train is that regardless of running time, it effectively doesn't take time out of your trip, because it's time you would have just spent asleep anyway, and it lands you in your destination city just as the day begins. The XPT is timetabled into Sydney Central at 6:59 a.m, roughly an hour earlier than you can get to the CBD on the first flight of the morning. I've caught that flight before, and it involved leaving home at something like 3:30 a.m. Also, if you happen to be making a trip like this midway through a journey, catching the night train replaces the cost of a night's accommodation. You actually don't want a night train to take much less than 11 hours. If it did, you'd either have to board later at night or get to the destination before dawn, both things that make the trip less practical. Right, so how did it all go? Honestly, it was fine. Good, even. We left home late in the afternoon, took a suburban train to the city where we got dinner, and were comfortably on board for the 7:50 p.m. departure. I'm not going to show you much of the actual sleeping compartment because it was obviously full of my family and photography wasn't exactly a high priority here. But if you'd like a very comprehensive look around, check out Rory Ding's video about the XPT Sleeper, where he shows the whole compartment in detail as well as reviewing his overall experience on the train. Having our own little room was really exciting for the kids, and we immediately appreciated being separate from the other passengers, with the kids able to explore, move around, play on the floor, all sorts of things you can't do while strapped into a seat on an aeroplane. For them, this really was a proper adventure. The compartment was configured for day mode when we got on, where the lower bunk is folded up to form 3 very comfortable seats. Heading north out of Melbourne, we entertained ourselves looking out the window, watching the lights of the suburbs slowly disappear into the night, which is another advantage of being in a compartment. You can turn off the lights whenever you want, making it easy to see out the window in the dark. I sat back and enjoyed a glass of wine from this reputable brand, Wine in a Glass. You can order a hot meal on the train, but you won't get it until close to 9 o'clock, which is why we ate beforehand. One of the staff comes through to lower the beds on request, and the kids loved watching the conversion into night mode. I'm not going to pretend I had the best night's sleep ever, but after a bit of excitement, both kids slept basically as they would normally at home, so we certainly weren't complaining. I'm sure a lot of you are wondering how easy it is to share a narrow bed on a moving train with a preschooler, and look, it's not exactly glamorous, but as a family used to going camping and kids that generally like to sleep near their parents anyway, it wasn't a massive issue for us. There were two little things that made it a bit difficult, however. Firstly, on the wall side of the bed, there's a sort of child-sized gap where the bed folds out. There is a piece of fabric preventing items or children falling down completely, but it's about 20 or 30 centimetres down, so enough for a small person to fall into. Luckily, we had some extra blankets with us that we used to fill this gap, and you could always stuff a jacket or something down there. The slightly bigger issue is that there's actually no railing whatsoever on the top bunk, which honestly I was kind of surprised by. Most adults are pretty good at not falling out of bed, but most kids are pretty good at falling out of bed, so this meant that after drawing the top bunk straw, I would definitely have to be on the outer side. I did find this a little disconcerting and really had to consider my sleeping position to limit the risk of falling off. The compartments alternate orientation, and we were in one with the seats facing backwards, so with the beds against the leading wall. And at one point during the night, the train made a pretty rough emergency stop, which was enough to dislodge a bag from the shelf on the opposite side. And it did cross my mind that if we'd been going in the other direction, that might have been me being thrown down. The Melbourne to Sydney line is well known for having some extremely average quality track in places, and the ride quality certainly varies enormously with some very rough sections. The train has a top speed of 130 km per hour in Victoria, but once over the border, it hammers along at 160 for a while between Albury and Wagga Wagga. After that, things start to get hilly, and the average speed really drops for the rest of the trip as the route winds around through the New South Wales Southern Highlands. And this is a big part of why the train takes about 2 hours longer than the non-stop driving time, despite having a higher maximum speed. Although, as I always have to remind people whenever this comes up, you should not drive non-stop for 9 hours, so in reality the times are likely to be quite comparable. Something I found I noticed more lying down than I had done in the sitting car, as the line starts getting windier, the lateral G-forces are actually very noticeable, quite a bit more than you'd normally expect on a train. Because the beds are side on to the direction of travel, this means alternately feeling the force pushing down to your feet or up to your head. This isn't really a complaint, I didn't mind the feeling, but it was a bit unusual and some people might find it hard to sleep through. However, feeling those forces, plus the patches of very rough track, really reminded me of a couple of quotes from this book, John Donne's History of Comenge Volume 4, which details the design and delivery of the XPT in the 1980s. Yes, this is the kind of thing that jumps into my mind when I'm trying to go to sleep. The XPT was highly political when it was introduced. Its design was heavily based on the British Intercity 125, and politicians desperately wanted it to be seen as a fast and glamorous train, but that really didn't account for the physical nature of the New South Wales rail network. When the XPT entered service, there was a widespread expectation that the new train would race through the countryside at unparalleled speeds. Clearly that did not, and indeed could not, happen. The early publicity, largely by the Labor government, trumpeted the XPT as a high-speed train, but it soon became obvious that there were very few stretches of track where it could come anywhere near achieving its potential speed of 160 km per hour. Thus, the general public felt somewhat let down by the XPT when it crawled at seeming snail's pace, for example, over the Blue Mountains to Dubbo. What the publicity failed initially to convey was that the XPT was a high-performance train, not a high-speed train. It was capable of high acceleration and rapid braking, and could corner faster than conventional trains. That meant its overall timing on runs was much less than previous trains on similar routes, though without many bursts of high speed. Savings of up to 20% in travel time was achieved by the XPT on certain routes and resulted in an increased patronage compared to the services it replaced. UK track is like a billiard table, whereas ours is like a billy goat track. This basically sums up my feelings about the XPT. A lot of people think of it as being an unreasonably slow train, but to me it does an incredibly good job of maintaining a decent average speed over winding alignments that were mostly designed in the steam era to avoid steep gradients, rather than to optimise top speeds for light passenger trains. It's a fast train, by Australian standards at least, it just isn't a fast railway. In the morning we were woken somewhere north of Mittagong, I think. I don't know that part of the line very well. One of the staff knocked on the door and brought us coffee and breakfast, our preferences for which they'd taken down the night before. The complimentary breakfast options are extremely limited, think airline-level breakfast at most, but there are more options available to purchase from the buffet car, and to be honest, the arrival time is early enough that I would generally just eat after leaving the train. However, being woken up by a knock on the door and a free coffee is certainly an improvement on the experience in the sitting car, where they just suddenly turn on the fluorescent lights. I must say, something I've always experienced on the XPT, regardless of the class of travel, is that the blow of the early wake-up is certainly softened by the dawn light slowly bringing the Southern Highlands scenery to life out the window. We were advised the train was running about 50 minutes late. Apparently we'd had to wait for police to retrieve some kids off the train that were attempting to escape from Wagga. But again, this is what's so good about being in a sleeping car. We didn't even notice the delay at the time, and the staff just woke us up 50 minutes later instead, so honestly it just wasn't an issue for us. Our train came into Sydney via its usual route along the East Hills line, but the cool thing about Sydney's suburban network is that, unlike Melbourne, there are multiple alternate routes for through trains, and in the past I've been on the XPT via Regent's Park. It's also possible to go via Granville and even via Bankstown. However, that option is going to disappear around the release time of this video as that line is being closed for conversion into a metro line. Despite having been on the train for close to 12 hours now, the kids were still in good spirits. They had, after all, been asleep for most of the trip, and the excitement quickly picked up again as they watched the unfamiliar scenery unfold out the window as we raced towards the city. We arrived into Sydney Central a little before 8 AM, which was actually better for us than the scheduled time of 6:59. We picked up our checked bag, something I've never done before on a train, and went and got some breakfast before jumping on a ferry to Taronga Zoo, getting there not long after opening time. We spent the next 4 days visiting family, doing Sydney things, getting around on trains, buses, ferries, trams, buses, trains and ferries. Fancy got lost at Circular Quay but fortunately showed up again, and Twinkletoes loved the Sydney nightlife. On the final day, we had fish and chips for lunch at Watson's Bay, then it was back to Circular Quay and on the train to the airport. Yes, I know the airport surcharge really sucks, especially for groups of people, but on the balance of all the other benefits, it's still by far the best way to get there from the CBD. One of my kids really hated going through security, something you, of course, don't have to do on a train. Then we made the 2,000-kilometre walk all the way down to Gate 57, where our Jetstar A320 was waiting. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the domestic flying experience in general, because I'm sure most of you have done it before. But just in case anyone hasn't, flying is a bit like catching the train, except there's no legroom, you have to wear a seatbelt, and the track is invisible. Our flight was delayed by about 15 minutes, which, based on my previous experiences, is pretty good. These planes make lots of relatively short flights throughout the day with short turnaround times, and the delays often build up quite a bit by the afternoon. The flight time was only just over an hour, and we kept the kids entertained with snacks, activities, picking up things they dropped on the floor, and more snacks, which was honestly a full-time job, and the book I'd optimistically put in my carry-on stayed firmly unopened. We did, however, get some cracking views of the Southern Alps and the Newport workshops. Basically, the flight was fine, but I feel like we really hit it lucky with the kids being in a good mood and being reasonably cooperative that afternoon, which is not always the case. It felt like this length of flight was towards the upper limit of what they would be okay with, and if they had become distressed or decided to chuck a tantrum, that would have been really hard to deal with in the aircraft environment, where you're basically confined to your seat in very close proximity to other passengers. On the train, however, there was much more scope to intervene early when they became restless. We could go for walks up and down the train, visit the buffet car, and even if that didn't work, at least we had our own compartment and wouldn't be impacting other passengers as much. 12 hours on the train was basically fine. A few tricky moments, but very manageable overall, and actually quite a pleasant experience for a good part of the trip. 1 hour on the plane was also basically fine, but it felt like we were a lot closer to the limit of what the kids would deal with. Any substantial delays at the airport or on the flight would have made it a lot more difficult, and as it was, they were pretty over it by the time we got to Melbourne. From the perspective of the kids, the fact that the two trips were the same distance is almost irrelevant, and they saw it as a full night on the train with bunk beds where they could explore and look out the window and play in different places around the compartment, compared to a short trip on a plane where they were confined to their seat, couldn't easily see out the window, and, the main complaint from my eldest, weren't allowed to constantly put the window blind up and down. Later, when I asked them which option they preferred, there was no hesitation. The train was way more fun. So, a few more general thoughts on the night train experience over this route. Melbourne to Sydney is the 5th busiest air corridor in the world, carrying something like 25,000 passengers every day. The aviation industry isn't decarbonising anytime soon, if ever, and while the ultimate answer to this is high-speed rail, that's another thing which isn't happening anytime soon and could be decades away even if we started work today. The XPT sleeping car is obviously very popular. From what I've seen, it's almost always booked out 2 to 3 months in advance, but the capacity is absolutely fixed. Each XPT set only contains one sleeping car, which has 18 beds, so that's the maximum number of people who have this option each night, in each direction. The fleet has a really high utilisation, so there's no availability to add a second sleeper, or indeed an entire additional train. Even the sitting cars on the XPT have been fully booked every time I've travelled, so the demand is obviously there, yet the timetable is virtually unchanged since the mid-90s. As far as I'm aware, Transport for New South Wales has no way of tracking how many potential bookings the sleeping car could have, or how many of those people still end up in the sitting car, or how many are just lost to the airlines. Ultimately, none of this is getting better anytime soon. The XPTs are getting old and are going to be replaced in the next couple of years by these things, which are already under construction and don't have a sleeping car at all. There has been quite a bit of pushback on this issue, and the state Labor government elected in 2023 has suggested they're looking at options, but I'm very sceptical that anything will come of it. It's important to remember that the XPT is not a specialised night train. Most XPT services are during the day, and because of that, it's mostly a sitting train, and the same will go for the replacement fleet. The sleeping cars do convert to first-class sitting cars during the day, but with a much lower capacity than a standard sitter. In day mode, the sleeping car still only fits 27 passengers, compared to 68 in an economy sitting car. To me, this is just an argument to get some dedicated night trains for the route. Sleeping cars are lower capacity, but there's no real reason why you can't have more of them. It's perfectly viable to run a 10 or 12 car train on this route, and yeah, we've been here before. The Southern Aurora was a dedicated sleeper train that ran on this route from 1962 to 1986. I honestly think a modern night train could be very popular if it was priced competitively and marketed properly, or even at all. I can't say I've ever seen any promotion of the current service. Compared to sitting up overnight, proper sleeping cars aren't just more comfortable, they're also more accessible to people with sensory issues and families travelling with young kids, as we discovered firsthand. Having a dedicated night train would also solve another problem. At the moment, the overnight XPT is formed by the day train, which has just 80 minutes at Southern Cross to be provisioned for the return trip, which also includes being refuelled, which is done at a purpose-built fuel point in Southern Cross Platform 1. For a train that covers such great distances, that 80 minutes can rapidly disappear if the inbound train gets delayed. And just like the airlines, this frequently pushes back the departure time for the return trip. Melbourne and Sydney are big places, they're not getting any smaller, and anything we can do to reduce reliance on the air route is definitely a good thing. If you want to experience the XPT sleeper for yourself, do it soon before they're all gone. And thanks very much for watching.